In 1972, a book called The Secret Life of Plants came out, and it shocked the world with claims that plants had consciousness, musical preferences, could be insulted, and even possessed psychic abilities. It gained so much public attention that Paramount made a feature film about it. The book was a New York Times bestseller, and many people reported playing music or talking to their plants after reading the book. It started to shape the way society as a whole looked at the plants around them. But what the public doesn't know is this book set back plant research for decades, has been completely rejected by science organizations since its release, and caused many scientists to leave the botany field or scientific work of any kind. So let's talk about one of the worst disasters in botanical history. Let's start with the authors Peter Tompkins and Christopher Bird. Tompkins was a journalist and served as a strategic service spy in Rome during World War II. Christopher Bird comes from a similar background as a journalist and former CIA agent. Neither of them had previous experience in a scientific or botanical field. As journalists, they just became fascinated with the stories and research they came across in regard to plant communication. So, an internationally recognized book written by two people with no botanical or scientific background is a great start. The first story that piqued their attention was an experiment performed by Cleve Backster. And this, honestly, is the experiment that got the ball of misinformation rolling. Like Peter Tompkins and Christopher Bird, Cleve Backster had no botanical or scientific background. One day, Backster decided to hook his Dracaena up to a polygraph machine. In over 20 years of polygraph work, he believed the best way to trigger a human being to react and make a spike on the polygraph was to threaten their well-being. So he dunked a leaf in a cup of hot coffee and got no spike, aka no reaction. He then thought maybe he had to harm the leaf that the electrode was connected to in order to get a reaction. So he thought about getting a match and burning a leaf, but before he could do that, the polygraph test produced a spike, meaning it picked up some type of reaction from the plant. Baxter's conclusion from this spike was that the plant could obviously read his mind because it reacted when he thought about burning the leaf. Common sense. In a much more recent study done in 2018, scientists found that plants have a very delayed responses to harm in comparison to animals and humans. I'll leave a link to this study in the description, by the way. When we get a cut or feel pain, our nerve signals travel up to 268 miles per hour, creating an almost immediate response to pain. And plants' reaction to pain is about 1 millimeter per second, which is equivalent to 0.002 miles per hour. These graphs and photos show it can take up to 5 minutes for a plant to elicit a full response to harm. So the more likely reason that the polygraph showed a spike was because of plants' natural delayed response to harm and not telekinesis. Sorry, Cleve. He also stated that his plants could respond to his emotions even if he was miles away. Baxter would hook his plant up to the polygraph before he left his house. He would carry a watch and a notebook around the city and record different things and how they made him feel throughout the day. And when he would get home, he would compare his notes to the results of the polygraph and claimed the plant reacted around the time some of the things he wrote down. It's important to note that just because a plant is eliciting a response doesn't mean we know exactly what that means. Baxter was interpreting the readings as if it were a human connected to the polygraph, not a plant. This kind of just feels like a case of confirmation bias, honestly. I also want to note that things that affect polygraph tests are heart rate, blood pressure, breathing, and perspiration. And while there's no real way to measure this equivalent in plants, they do a similar process to perspiration called transpiration. This is a process in which excess water is released through pores on the leaf surface into the atmosphere as a vapor. It's a good possibility that the polygraph might have picked up on this natural process as a person sweating. Another possibility is that plants move around a lot more than we think during the day, and this could have caused a false result as well. Other things that could have skewed the results are static electricity, humidity, electrode movement, and natural processes within the plant. The point is, there was a lot of other possibilities that could have explained these reactions, and having some kind of botanical knowledge would have been helpful here. But Baxter's experiments didn't just catch the eye of Peter Tompkins and Christopher Bird. It also caught the eye of a chemist/physicist named Marcel Vogel. And you might be thinking, finally, a scientist has entered the chat. But this is not going where you think it's going. Marcel's specialties included luminescence, phosphor technologies, magnetics, and crystals. Some of his inventions included fluorescent paints for billboards and marketing, luminescent tracers to track bacteria, diseases, and even cancer, a black light kit to trace rodent infestations through their urine tracts, properties of different crystals and minerals, the magnetic coating on hard disk drives, and the Vogel cut diamond. So before I get into his involvement on this botanical disaster, I want to acknowledge that he was a brilliant scientist, had inventions we still use today, and was very well respected by his peers in the scientific community. But he wasn't a biologist or a botanist. His work with plants is comparable to letting your physician perform heart surgery. Yes, they have the basic knowledge of how to treat some heart diseases, but they should be nowhere near an OR. And a lot of his discoveries were based off of human psychology comparisons and the opinions of psychics. Yes, you heard that right, psychics. And I actually can't count the number of times this book says or references psychics. He even did a whole experiment based off of the opinion of his psychic friend, Vivian Wiley. She picked 2 leaves from a saxifrage plant in her garden and placed one on her bedside table and one on the table in her living room. Every morning she would wake up and will the plant to live, and I'm not kidding when I say that's a direct quote from Vivian herself. In the next months, she invited Vogel back to her house, where he observed the leaf she had paid no attention to shrivel up and almost dead, and the leaf she spoke to every day was still doing well. And Vogel was convinced that he was witnessing psychic energy taking place. So a couple things here. Number one is that there was only 2 test subjects in this whole experiment. To get an accurate result, you would need a much larger subject pool. Number 2 is to get accurate results, you would need to keep all of the leaves in the same place in the same conditions. Like I said earlier, she kept one on her bedside table and one in the living room. Light, humidity, temperature, when the last time the mother plant was watered, and so many other things, how the plant was cut would affect how the leaf died. And again, Marcel Vogel classified all of these results using human psychology terms. And you can't compare plant behavior to human behavior. And I want to reiterate that Marcel Vogel was a well-respected scientist across many fields. Although this experiment was very poorly done, I don't want to slander him as a person or leave any doubts about his actual successful inventions. I think his work with plants was just a major case of anecdotal evidence and confirmation bias. Vogel was reportedly the only one able to repeat Baxter's experiment and noted that you had to build a relationship with the plant to be able to communicate with it. And I think relationship is very open to interpretation here. And while he was repeating the original experiment, if the plant stopped responding, he chalked it up to the plant had run out of energy and needed to rest. Again, without exploring any other possibility for the lack of response, this is just a case of confirmation bias. So when The Secret Life of Plants was released, these myths quickly took over the public with inaccurate information and speculation. Science organizations cut funding for grant proposals that even hinted at plant intelligence or communication. Scientists who had actually been researching probable theories in relation to plant communication had projects cut, and anyone with new ideas would never see them out. American scientists even called The Secret Life of Plants a corpus of fallacious or unprovable claims. And this set back plant research by decades out of fear of another public disaster. And the dust is only starting to settle from the bombshell that was The Secret Life of Plants. Some research began again in the early 2000s in regard to plant intelligence, communication, and consciousness. For example, researchers discovered that plants without predators, like plants that live in Hawaii, will not produce their natural defense mechanisms. So mint doesn't taste like mint and stinging nettle doesn't sting. But how could you stop producing a defense mechanism if you weren't aware of predators being around you? And some plants have been observed to produce a pheromone to warn plants of the same species in their area about an attack from insects. So, how could it warn other plants if it wasn't aware of the attack? And how could other plants respond if they weren't aware of the communication? They will also change the way they grow in response to stimulation, like growing towards light. And there are plants with special adaptations like Venus flytraps that also lead to questions about plant consciousness. Venus flytraps have trigger hairs on the inside of their mouths, and two of these hairs need to be triggered before the mouth closes on the prey. So in a way, they know how to count. There's also the infamous Bacquilla, which mimes other plants. It literally imitates the plants growing around them. So how could you impersonate something that you aren't aware of? How all of this works is still a mystery, but I think it's safe to say it isn't observable through polygraph tests and can't be solved by psychics. If you want to read something that will give you actual scientifically backed up information about plant consciousness and intelligence, I recommend The Light Eaters by Zoe Schlanger. She personally spoke with many of the scientists that she quotes in this book and received their research paper and notes. She even has findings attributed to her on a field expedition. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed the plant drama. Next week's video is going to be a tissue culture video, and you can leave your guesses in the comments as to what plant I'm going to be using. And I hope to see you next time.